Preface to From Sail to Steam. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From Sail to Steam. Recollections of Naval Life by Alfred Thayer Mahan. Preface. When I was a boy, some years before I obtained my appointment in the Navy, I spent many of those happy hours that only childhood knows poring over the back numbers of a British service periodical, which began its career in 1828 with the title Colburn's United Service Magazine, under which name, save and except the Colburn, it still survives. Besides weightier matters, its early issues abounded in reminiscences by naval officers, then yet in the prime of life, who had served through the great Napoleonic wars. More delightful still, it had numerous nautical stories, based probably on facts, serials under such entrancing titles as Leaves from My Logbook, by Flexible Grommet, past midshipman, a pen name, the nautical felicity of which will be best appreciated by one who has had the misfortune to handle a grommet which was not flexible. Then there was The Order Book, by Jonathan Oldjunk, an epithet so suggestive of the waste heap, even to a landsman's ears, that one marvels a man ever took it unto himself, especially in that decline of life when we are more sensitive on the subject of bodily disabilities than once we were. Old Junk, however, can yet be worked up, as the sea expression goes, into other uses, and that perhaps was what Mr. Oldjunk meant. His early adventures, as a young luff, were for economical reasons worked up into their present literary shape, with the addition of a certain amount of extraneous matter, love-making, and the like. Indeed, so far from uselessness, the veteran seaman and rigid economist, the Earl of St. Vincent, then First Lord of the Admiralty, had given to a specific form of old junk, viz. Shakings, the honors of a special order, for the preservation thereof, the which forms the staple of a comical anecdote in Basil Hall's Fragments of Voyages and Travels, itself a superior example of the instructive recollections of less literary merit, which but for Colburn's would have perished. As anyone who has attempted to write history knows what queer nuggets of useful information lie hidden away in such papers, how they often help to reconstruct an incident or determine a mooted point. If the Greeks, after the Peloponnesian War, had had a Colburn's, we should have a more certain, if not a perfect, clue to the reconstruction of the trireme, and probably even could deduce with some accuracy the daily routine, the several duties, and hear the professional jokes and squabbles of their officers and crews. The serious people who write history can never fill the place of the gossips, who pour out an unpremeditated mixture of intimate knowledge and idle trash. The trash, upon the whole, is not the trash the truest history? Perhaps not the most valuable, but the most real. If you want contemporary color, contemporary atmosphere, you must seek it among the impressions which can be obtained only from those who have lived a life amid particular surroundings which they breathe and which colors them, dyes them in the wool. However skillless, they cannot help reproducing, any more than water poured from an old ink bottle can help coming out more or less black, although, if sufficiently pretentious, they can monstrously caricature, especially if they begin with the modest, time-worn admission that they are more familiar with the marlinspike than with the pen. But even the caricature born of pretentiousness will not prevent the unpremeditated betrayal of conditions, facts, and incidents, which help reconstruct the milieu. How much more, then, the unaffected simplicity of the born storyteller? I do not know how Froissart ranks as an authority with historians. I have not read him for years, and my recollections are chiefly those of childhood, with all the remoteness and all the vividness which memory preserves from early impressions. I think I might now find him wearisome, not so in boyhood. He was to me then, and seems to me now, a glorified flexible grommet or Jonathan Oldjunk, ranking as to them as Boswell does towards the common people of biography. That there are many solid chunks of useful information to be dug out of him, I am sure. That his stories are all true, I have no desire to question. But what among it all is so instructive, so entertaining, as the point of view of himself, his heroes, and his colloquists, the particular contemporary modification of universal human nature in which he lived and moved, and had his being? If such a man has the genius of his business as had Froissart and Boswell, it excels in proportion to his unconsciousness of the fact. His colors run truer. For lesser gobblers who have not genius, the best way to lose consciousness is just to let themselves go. If they endeavor to paint artistically, the muddle will be worse. To such the proverb of the cobbler and his last is a perennial warning. As a barber once sagely remarked to me, you can't trim a beard well unless you're born to it. It is possible in some degree to imitate Froissart and Boswell in that marvelous diligence to accumulate material which was common to them both. But, when gathered, how impossible it is to work up that old junk into permanent, engrossing interest, let those answer who have grappled with ancient chronicles or with many biographies. So, with a circumlocution which probably convicts me in advance of decisive deficiency as a narrator, I let myself go. I have no model, unless it be the old man sitting in the sun on a summer's day, bringing forth out of his memories things new and old, mostly old. A. Mahan. Introducing myself. While extracts from the following pages were appearing in Harper's Magazine, I received a letter from a reader, hoping that I would say something about myself before entering the Navy. This had been outside my purpose, which was chiefly to narrate what had passed around me that I thought interesting, but it seems possibly fit to establish in a few words my antecedents by heredity and environment. I was born September 27th, 1840, within the boundaries of the State of New York, but not upon its territory. The place, West Point on the Hudson River, having been ceded to the general government for the purposes of the military academy, at which my father, Dennis Hart Mahan, was then professor of engineering, as well civil as military. He himself was of pure Irish blood, his father and mother, already married, having emigrated together from the old country early in the last century. But he was also American by birthright, having been born in April 1802, very soon after the arrival of his parents in the city of New York. There also he was baptized into the Roman Catholic Church in the parish of St. Peter's, the church building of which now stands far downtown in Barclay Street. It is not, I believe, the same that existed in 1802. Very soon afterwards, before he reached an age to remember, his parents removed to Norfolk, Virginia, where he grew up and formed his earliest associations. As is usual, these colored his whole life. He was always a Virginian in attachment and preference. In the days of crisis he remained firm to the Union, by conviction and affection, but he broke no friendships, and to the end there continued in him that surest positive indication of local fondness, admiration for the women of what was to him his native land. In beauty, in manner, and in charm they surpassed. "Your mother is Northern," he once said to me, "and very few can approach her; but still, in the general, none compare for me with the Southern woman." The same causes, early association, gave him a very pronounced dislike to England; for he could remember the War of 1812, and had experienced the embittered feeling, which was probably nowhere fiercer than around the shores of the Chesapeake, the scene of the most widespread devastation inflicted, partly from motives of policy, partly as measures of retaliation. Spending afterwards 3 or 4 years of early manhood in France, he there imbibed a warm feeling for the people, among whom he contracted several intimacies. He there knew personally Lafayette and his family, receiving from him the hospitality which the Marquis's service in the War of Independence and his then recent ovation during his tour of the United States in 1825 prompted him to extend to Americans. This communication with a man who could tell, and did tell him, intimate stories of intercourse with Washington doubtless emphasized my father's patriotic prejudices as well as his patriotism. When he revisited France in 1856, he found many former friends still alive, and when I myself went there for the first time in 1870, he asked me too to hunt them up, but they had all then disappeared. His fondness for the French doubtless accentuated his repugnance to the English, at that time still their traditional enemy. The combination of Irish and French prepossession could scarcely have resulted otherwise, and thus was evolved an atmosphere in which I was brought up, not only passively absorbing, but to a certain extent actively impressed with love for France and the southern section of the United States, while learning to look askance upon England and abolitionists. The experiences of life, together with subsequent reading and reflection, modified, and in the end entirely overcame, these early prepossessions. My father was for over 40 years professor at West Point, of which he had been a graduate. In short, the academy was his life, and he there earned what I think I am modest in calling a distinguished reputation. The best proof of this, perhaps, is that at even so early a date in our national history as his graduation from the academy, in 1824, he was thought an officer of such promise as to make it expedient to send him to France for the higher military education in which the country of Napoleon and his marshals then stood preeminent. From 1820, when he entered the academy as a pupil, to his death in 1871, he was detached from it only these 3 or 4 years. Yet this determination of his life's work proceeded from a mere accident, scarcely more than a boy's fancy. He had begun the study of medicine under Dr. Archer of Richmond, but he had a very strong wish to learn drawing. In those primitive days the opportunity of instruction was wanting where he lived, and hearing that it was taught at the military academy, he set to work for an appointment, not from inclination to the calling of a soldier, but as a means to this particular end. It is rather singular that he should have had no bias toward the profession of arms, for although he drifted almost from the first into the civil branch, as a teacher and then professor, I have never known a man of more strict and lofty military ideas. The spirit of the profession was strong in him, though he cared little for its pride, pomp, and circumstance. I believe that in this observation others who knew him well agree with me. The work of a teacher, however important and absorbing in itself, does not usually offer much of interest to readers. My father, by the personal contact of teacher and taught, knew almost every one of the distinguished generals who fought in the War of Secession, on either the Union or the Confederate side. With scarcely an exception, they had been his pupils. But his own life was uneventful. He married in 1839 Mary Helena O'Kill, of New York City. My mother's father was English, her mother an American, but with a strong strain of French blood, her maiden name, Mary J., being that of a Huguenot family which had left France under Louis XIV. By the time of her birth in 1786, a good deal of American admixture had doubtless qualified the original French. But I remember her well, and though she lived to be 73, she had up to the last a vivacity and keen enjoyment of life, more French than American, reflected from quick black eyes, which fairly danced with animation through her interest in her surroundings. From my derivation, therefore, I am a pretty fair illustration of the mix-up of bloods which seems destined to bring forth some new and yet undecipherable combination on the North American continent. 1/2 Irish, 1/4 English, and a good deal more than a trace of French would appear to be the showing of quantitative analysis. Yet, as far as I understand my personality, I think to see in the result the predominance which the English strain has usually asserted for itself over others. I have none of the gregariousness of either the French or Irish, and while I have no difficulty in entering into civil conversation with a stranger who addresses me, I rarely begin, having, upon the whole, a preference for an introduction. This is not perverseness, but lack of facility, and I believe Froissart noted something of the same in the Englishman of 500 years ago. I have, too, an abhorrence of public speaking, and a desire to slip unobserved into a back seat wherever I am, which amount to a mania. But I am bound to admit I get both these dispositions from my father, whose Irishry was undiluted by foreign admixture. In my boyhood, till I was nearly 10, West Point was a very sequestered place. It was accessible only by steamboats, and during great part of the winter months not by them, the Hudson being frozen over most of the season as far as 10 to 20 miles lower down. The railroad was not running before 1848, and then it followed the east bank of the river. One of my early recollections is of begging off from school one day, long enough to go to a part of the post distant from our house, whence I caught my first sight of a train of cars on the opposite shore. Another recollection is of the return of a company of engineer soldiers from the war with Mexico. The detachment was drawn up for inspection where we boys could see it. One of the men had grown a full beard, a sight to me then as novel as the railroad, and I announced it at home as a most interesting fact. I had as yet seen only clean shaven faces. Among my other recollections of childhood are, as superintendent of the academy, Colonel Robert E. Lee, afterwards the great Confederate leader, and McClellan, then a junior engineer officer. As my boyhood advanced, the abolition movement was gaining strength, to the great disapprobation and dismay of my father, with his strong Southern and Union sympathies. I remember that when Uncle Tom's Cabin came out in my 12th year, the master of the school I attended gave me a copy, being himself, I presume, one of the rising party adverse to slavery. My father took it out of my hands, and I came to regard it much as I would a bottle labeled poison. In consequence, I never read it in the days of its vogue, and I have to admit that since then, in mature years, I have not been able to continue it after beginning. The same motives, in great part, led to my being sent to a boarding school in Maryland, near Hagerstown, which drew its pupils very largely, though not exclusively, from the South. The environment would be upon the whole Southern. I remained there, however, only 2 years, my father becoming dissatisfied with my progress in mathematics. In 1854, therefore, I matriculated as a freshman at Columbia College in the city of New York, where I remained till I went to the Naval Academy. My entrance into the Navy was greatly against my father's wish. I do not remember all his arguments, but he told me he thought me much less fit for a military than a civil profession, having watched me carefully. I think myself now that he was right, for though I have no cause to complain of unsuccess, I believe I should have done better elsewhere. While thus more than dissenting from my choice, he held that a child should not be peremptorily thwarted in his scheme of life. Consequently, while he would not actively help me in the doubtful undertaking of obtaining an appointment, which depended then as now upon the representative from the congressional district, he gave me the means to go to Washington, and also 2 or 3 letters to personal friends, among them Jefferson Davis, then Secretary of War, and James Watson Webb, a prominent character in New York journalism and in politics, both state and national. Thus equipped, I started for Washington on the first day of 1856, being then 3 months over 15. As I think now of my age and more than usual diffidence, and of my omission to win the favor of a politician who had constituents to reward, whereas to all my family practical politics were as foreign as Sanskrit, I know not whether the situation was more comical or pathetic. On the way I foregathered with a Southern lad, some 3 years my senior, returning home from England, where he had been at school. He beguiled the time by stories of his experiences, to me passing strange, and I remember in crossing the Susquehanna, which was then by ferry boat, looking at the fields of ice fragments, I said it would be unpleasant to fall in. "I would sooner have a knife stuck into me," he replied. I wonder what became of him, for I never knew his name. Of course, he entered the Confederate Army, but what besides? I remember my week's stay in Washington much as I suppose a man overboard remembers the incidents of that experience. Memory is an odd helpmate. Why some circumstances take hold and others not is one of those things no fellow can find out. I saw the member of Congress, who I find by reference to have been Ambrose S. Murray, representative of the district within which West Point lay. He received me kindly, but with reserve characteristic of most interviews, where one party desires a favor for which he has nothing in exchange to offer. I think, however, that Mr. Webb, with whom and his family I breakfasted one day, said some good words for me. Jefferson Davis was a graduate of the Military Academy of 1827, and although his term there had overlapped my father's by only 1 year, his interest in everything pertaining to the army had maintained between them an acquaintance approaching intimacy. He therefore was very cordial to the boy before him, and took me round to the office of the then Secretary of the Navy, Mr. James C. Dobbin, of North Carolina. Just why I do not understand yet, as the Secretary could not influence my immediate object. Perhaps he felt the need of a friendly chat, for I remember that after presenting me the two sat down and discussed the President's message, of which Davis expressed a warm approval. This being the time of the protracted contest over the speakership, which ended in the election of Banks, I suppose the colleagues were talking about a document which was then ready and familiar to them, but which was not actually sent to Congress until it organized, some weeks after this interview. Probably their conversation was the aftermath of a cabinet meeting. I returned home with fairly sanguine hopes, which on the journey received a douche of cold water from an old gentleman, a distant connection of my family, to visit whom I stopped a few hours in Philadelphia. He asked about my chance of the appointment, and being told that it seemed good, he rejoined, "Well, I hope you won't get it. I have known many naval officers, captains and lieutenants in different parts of the world." For his time, he was then nearly 80, he had traveled extensively. "I have talked much with them, and know that it is a profession with little prospect." Then he quoted Dr. Johnson: "No man will be a sailor who has contrivance enough to get himself into jail, for being in a ship is being in a jail with the chance of being drowned." And further to overwhelm me, he clinched the saying by a comment of his own: "In a ship of war you run the risk of being killed as well as that of being drowned." The interview left me a perplexed but not a wiser lad. Late in the ensuing spring, Mr. Murray wrote me that he would nominate me for the appointment. Just what determined him in my favor I do not certainly know, but as I remember Mr. Davis had authorized me to say to him that, if the place were given to me, he would use his own influence with President Pierce to obtain for a nominee from his district a presidential appointment to the Military Academy. Mr. Murray replied that such a proposition was very acceptable to him, because the tendency among his constituents was much more to the Army than to the Navy. At that day, besides one cadet at West Point for each congressional district, which was in the gift of the representative, the law permitted the President a certain number of annual appointments called at-large, the object being to provide for sons of military and naval officers whose lack of political influence made it difficult otherwise to enter the school. This presidential privilege has since been extended to the Naval Academy, but had not then. The proposed interchange in my case, therefore, would be practically to give an officer's son an appointment at large in the Navy. Whether this arrangement was actually carried out, I have never known nor inquired; but it has pleased me to believe, as I do, that I owe my entrance to the United States Navy to the interposition of the first and only President of the Southern Confederacy, whose influence with Mr. Pierce is a matter of history. I entered the Naval Academy as an acting midshipman, September 30th, 1856. End of preface.